Hey, so I just did a video on why Trump should collapse the economy by raising interest rates and cutting spending and defaulting on the debt. And in order to save it, in order to reset the economy, and but the really fundamental issue seems to me is is violence excusable in the case of government? Because nobody's recognizing the fact that government is a monopoly on the initiation of violence. Some people, one graduate student came to a lecture I gave 2 years ago and actually said the government's not a monopoly. And what he meant was that it's not a monopoly of ascendancy, because some people, like the Amish, they don't ascend to the government. They ascend to their religion or their lifestyle or something. There's a lot of for instance, I don't ascend to government since I'm an anarchist. I don't believe in government, which is the point of this video. And but what government is a monopoly on the ability to confiscate resources from the people. It's very hard for people who are religiously leftist, conservative or liberal, progressive or right-wing, to jump into that, especially I think the left. I think the left is a little bit more vulnerable in this respect. I think they're a little bit more attached to social engineering, to the intellectualisms of social engineering, that they can't see that there's violence behind social engineering. I mean, they're so compassionate and yet so hypocritical. So much do they hate Trump, and yet when Obama slaughtered, and they call him a racist for having the travel halt. They call him a racist, and they call it a Muslim ban. Of course, it wasn't a Muslim ban, since 87% of the Muslims in the world can come here. That they ignore the fact that Obama slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Muslims, just slaughtered them. I mean, it's much worse. It's a much terrible thing to ban people from coming here, but slaughtering people's okay as long as you're a left-winger, right? So they've lost all credibility. The left, not just the elitist left, but the rank and file left. When you look on Facebook and they go down this, I had a big long list of contributors dismissing Trump as a loser, and they never said a thing about the murderous nature of Obama or the NDAA, the fact that he's big on spying. I mean, he really upgraded the spying on Americans, turned it into a hyper 1984. So, as far as the spying aspect goes, but government is a monopoly on the initiation of violence. It reserves the right to conscript our resources, to give us services that they say that we need. For instance, you have police here in town, and the city council guy, one of my fellow TM Sithas, got on the radio and said, well, the crime rate's going up slightly, so therefore we're going to apply for a grant to get another police officer. But you see, when you do things through a monopoly, through violence, there's one element that's missing. When you do this, that element's not missing when you do those things voluntarily, right? And that element is that the people tell you whether or not they're pleased by what they had given you or they would give you their money for. And therefore, if you're successful in business, which is a voluntary thing, you're helping people according to their own lights. And of course, the left doesn't believe in anybody else's lights. They just don't believe in it. The left tells you how I'm going to make you happy. And the right, of course, is the same way in terms of foreign policy. I suppose there are a lot of subtleties involved in this, but you get the picture. When we went into Iraq, we slaughtered 1 million people. And the decade before, we slaughtered 500,000 or whatever through all those sanctions, right? We sanctioned to death 500,000 children that Madeleine Albright agreed to and said it was necessary. You know, I mean, necessary. Just necessary to starve children to death or let them have medical shortages. So that's what we're dealing with around here. In this world, we're dealing with psychopaths, not just the people who perpetrate murder and who don't say, but also the people who don't say anything about it, both on the right and on the left. And of course, the left is insane regarding welfare and social spending, because the giver must always be in a personal relationship with the receiver, or at least in a voluntary relationship with the receiver, so that he could judge whether or not what he's giving is doing any good for what he's giving. In other words, it must always be a voluntary giving. Compulsory giving to a social system is insane. A third-party giving is insane, because the arbitrator or the middleman has no way of knowing if the people are happy on an individual level. That's the component of society, is the individual. That's the person who matters, is the individual. The left is so in love with the idea of making society an engineering project. And of course, the right is so in love with the idea of that the rest of the people, somebody outside your tribe, is not human. So it goes both ways. In the early part of the country, the Native Americans were not considered human. The Africans weren't considered human. So that's the weakness of the right. And we slaughter people. And of course, all the people that went over there, all the young men and women that went over there suckered, got PTSD. And they're all fucked up, you know, psychologically. And so anyway, in the voluntary situation, let's say go back into this police situation. Let's supposing instead of having a government police system, we had free enterprise police systems. Now, immediately, the intellectual, this quasi-intellectual, is going to say, well, they would be at war with each other, because there would be conflicts between the patrons of each company, of each police company. And but that's simply not the way the world works. I mean, it's like saying there would be war between insurance companies. There's no problems between insurance companies. They just predetermine how they're going to measure things. They have to, because you see what you don't understand is that economics is not an experimental science. It's a science of horse sense. It's common horse sense. The world, the government, schools that we've had the last 100 years have knocked the shit out of our common horse sense. If you're in business, you're in the policing business. It's this free enterprise business in town here, right? You're not going to go to war with anybody. There ain't no money in that. And you're not going to try to conquer the whole goddamn place and be the warlord. It's too fucking risky. People will see what you're doing if you're building up armaments. It just isn't going to happen. You can always make more money through voluntary exchange. I mean, conquering the world is hard as hell because people don't like to be conquered. They hate being conquered. It's like trying to conquer it's like trying to compress water inside a steel container or something. The more you press, the harder it gets. And going to war only works if you're a government. It only works if you're the government, because the government doesn't go to war. It suckers everybody. It taxes the people, which is very hard to do. So they create central banks, like the Federal Reserve, so they can tax the people in a stealth way, kind of way, under the radar kind of way. That's why they created the Federal Reserve. I mean, they created it so that the people that created it, the Rockefellers and the Morgans, wanted to get cheap money. There's a huge interest for cheap money, see. But as soon as Wilson and whoever, they were tied to the Brits, decided that they wanted to go to war, they changed the law so that the Fed could buy open market purchases, or whatever it's called. I'm not sure about the mechanics, but I guess before that it was illegal for the Federal Reserve to do open market purchases of T-bills or treasuries, or whatever the hell they're called, government bonds, right? So you couldn't inflate meaning creating money out of thin air, to fund the government, which is a form of theft, because then the currency becomes worth less. So that's what the governments do when they're. That's why governments go to war, because they have this ability to inflate and to steal in a stealth kind of way. See, Lincoln, when he started the Civil War, and it was all his fault. I mean, they fired on Fort Sumter, but Lincoln was just goading them to do that, and then trying to get the people in the North pissed off, and they thought they could win in a couple of months. See, and then they destroyed more died in that war than in World War II. So anyway, that was a huge loss. I was like, they estimate recently it's 800,000. But Lincoln, he had to do inflation with the greenbacks, and then he also had to do bonds. They sold a lot of bonds, see. But in those days, of course, there were savings in the country, as there was during all the war, guns and butter spending that Reagan did, as there was during the 60s, see. But so private businesses, private police, let's say, they don't like to go to war. They can't go to war. It's nearly impossible, right? Because everybody's going to see what you're doing, and it takes huge amounts of resources to go to war, to be the dominant gangster on the block. But so the tendency in a free market is to make deals voluntarily, and it is associated with respect for other people. The environment of voluntarism grows out of the respect for other people that our parents gave us by loving us as individuals. As individuals, we're not objects. We're not knowable beings. We don't know each other. Nobody gets that. I don't know anything about you, even if I've known you all my life. If I'm your mother, I don't really know you that well. I might know you a little bit better than somebody else, but that's how. But and that's why life is based on personal, so you can at least approximate what would please the other person. Free enterprise is all about pleasing the other person. So these cops in town, let's say they had a private police force in town, they're always thinking, in private enterprise, you're always thinking of a better way to serve. You're thinking about it for yourself so you can make more money. And by the way, nobody loves anybody else. If you love somebody else, it's only because you're doing it for yourself. It has to be a self-referral process. Altruism has to be a self-referral process, and it has to be voluntary because it has to be intimate. It has to be the closest estimate. And you do a lot of talking with the person you're interacting with and get a lot of feedback from in every way you can. One of the main feedbacks is what I said earlier about the confiscation of resources. It's not by force. It's by the accumulation of their resources comes voluntarily, and if they don't do it, then you change your ways or you go out of business, right? With government, they don't go out of business when they do bad. They just get more money. It's perverse. Government is perverse. Even an enlightened society has no feedback mechanism if it has an involuntary system. Because the whole point of feedback, of whether or not you like what you're getting through this personal connection of various forms, right? Written and spoken and just withdrawal of business. And they call you up, how come you're not coming to our business anymore? Well, because I got this better deal down the street, see? They thought of a neater way to protect my property, a much more efficient way. They charge much less, We talk about the police again. Police in town here, we're going to go through all this government crap. It's just crap. It's just theft. In the name of service, it's theft. That's all it is. Any instance in history, it's insanely ineffective. And if it isn't effective, compared to what? Not compared to voluntarism, right? So without the feedback mechanism of voluntarism, you're looking at coercion and a lack of and there's no way to know for the provider to know whether the customers are satisfied. And I mean, you could because there's no the mechanisms of in a complex society, the mechanisms of feedback is a huge web. It's a huge web of feedback. And so there's at each point in that web, there's that personal connection, you see, because it's voluntary. Voluntary and personal and love and altruism all go together. And of course, they're all based on self-interest. Subjectivity is the basis of objectivity. There's no objective universe apart from subjectivity. Otherwise, how would you know? No, it's your subjective mechanism that defines the world. That's the definition of objective world, of the world. Is you learn language from your mother, And then you put words to your experience, and that creates the world. Because everybody looks at the world differently. Every creature looks at the world differently. There's no objective world. It depends on who's looking. And but that's the foundation of the whole thing. But my arguments work above that level. Above that foundational level, you know as well as I do that if you don't have feedback through voluntarism, that voluntarism cannot exist. I mean, feedback cannot come without voluntarism. I mean, how much feedback does a slave have? You know, yeah, he can say something to his master, but if the master's not willing to let him go, how much does he really care how he feels? Right? So, besides which, slavery is a constricted relationship. It's not that complex web of relationships that a society has when it's free. It's called the free market. But it isn't just commerce. It isn't just materialism. It's humanity. It's humanity. Humanity is linked to voluntarism. Inhumanity is linked to force. So government is not just lacks the feedback mechanism. This cop situation in town lacks the feedback mechanism. It's also that it's inhuman. That the coercive nature of government is inhuman, and there's nobody that's ever justified it, not even coming close, because the mechanics of human interaction are the mechanics of individual self-fulfillment. For instance, in economics, the division between the totalitarian economics, which is what developed in the 20th century, I mean, there's always a tendency towards this controlling economics, is that in that system, the people are objects. See, they have this thing called in modern economics called general equilibrium theory. And it thinks of the economic system as a kind of a static thing that you can just pump money into. When it slows up. It's like an engineering project. You pump money into it and try to get it to go again. But it ignores that all the elements in the system are humans who, as I was saying earlier, are the ones that are creating the world, both in their own terms, but also in a shared sense. Not just in a subjective sense, but in an objective sense. You know, they're creating self-driving cars now, for instance. Computers, everything that's done on a computer is creative. But even before the modern age, you still had the same principles of being able to create marketing mechanisms or even technologies, see? Ways of increasing the satisfaction of people. And you're increasing the satisfaction because it's voluntary. Now, that principle that distinguishes modern economics from real economics, I mean the mainstream from real economics, is that when you and I trade a dollar bill for a pen, it's not a zero-sum game. It's a win-win situation, right? When we voluntarily exchange, it's because each of us values what the other guy had more valuable than we have, that we were willing to trade. See? Aristotle said, no, we're trading equal things. Aristotle was wrong. We're actually increasing. So we're creating. The subjective creates the objective. Now I'm not just saying that in terms of economics. I'm saying that also on that, as I said earlier, that's the metaphysical, that's the actual reality of the world, is something we've created from inside us. Right? I mean, if you're a man and a dog sitting on a porch and a man's walking up in a suit, And the man thinks to himself, "Oh, good, I'm getting my check, or I'm getting a contract to sign." And the dog thinks, "Well, I'm getting my biscuit." You see, it isn't the same world. And so that's the reality, is that we create according to our consciousness. And as soon as you give up power to somebody who says, no, you're not a subjective being who creates the world. You're an object. You're a part of an engineering system, and I'm a social engineer. See, that's what this guy in town, this Sidha, who got on the radio and said, well, we're going to get a grant in order to get another police officer because crime rate's slightly up. Well, why not get rid of the government altogether and we'll hire our own cops? And then if you don't like the way your cops are taking care of your property or your person or your neighborhood or whatever, just hire another one. Just hire a different competitive service. You're going to get the best service possible that way, right? Because you got a choice. How do you get the best service of anything? How do you get the best product? You choose. You don't choose with government, do you? You don't choose with government. And yet we never talk about that because you went to government schools the last 150 years, 20 years or something. See? These are psychopaths. These are sociopaths who want to engineer society when society is filled with life. Each individual is his own universe. So the logic of all this, and economics is just logic and common sense, horse sense really. It's not what they teach in schools. What they teach in schools is garbage. It's trying to mathematically model us as if we were a physical system. I mean, some mainstream economists say some things that are true, but they're actually contradicting their epistemology. Because on the one hand, they say, no, we're being scientific like physics, but that's not the kind of science it is. It's a logic. Economics is logic. So the logic of systems being voluntary is that the entire world is better off because everybody's choosing what they want, and since everybody else is choosing what they want, there's more opportunity. See, and even things that we don't think of because of we've had so much socialism, so much government control for so many decades, things like the environmental issue, that's really a private property issue. That's me, right? And that's why insurance companies are come along. And don't confuse the fascist markets that we have today in insurance with a free market in insurance. No matter where you are in terms of, see, insurance is a kind of a collective thing, right? So even on that level of economics, if there's choice, all of a sudden they're out to serve you, because if you can back away, you can pull your dough out of that system. They're gonna find out why or go out of business, right? So now you should be disabused of all these 120 years of education, this logical positivist or proto-logical positivist education. A real society is a voluntary society. What sense does it make to say a society, but there's a threat involved? Do you associate the word society with threat? I suppose subliminally you probably do, right? We think of Victorian society, but there wasn't that many cops in 19th century. There wasn't that much government in 19th century England had very, very little government, and traditional societies had no government. Ancient England, pre second millennium England had very little government. It was all local things. And in those days, it was more restitutive instead of retributive. Ancient Ireland was that way. And the Zir system in Somalia is like that, which works very well, by the way. The problems in Somalia don't come from the Zir system of voluntary exchange. They come from all the government impositions. Voluntary exchange works just fine in any field, because you're talking about letting humanity operate in any field. You're talking about, humans being allowed to be humans instead of thought of as objects of an engineering project. So there's plenty of evidence, but the in terms of history, but that's not evidence. That's not evidence. No. That's just illustration of the logic and common sense or self-referral awareness. Who are you? Are you an object, or are you the creator of your environment? Is everybody the creator of their environment? Of course they are. The amoeba is creating his own environment by his consciousness, right? The dog creates an environment. Humans create an environment. Completely enlightened humans create an environment. But it's different for everyone. It's a different universe. It's a different reality. So why have the element of fear and coercion when you can have the element that we were taught by our parents of respect for us as individuals? Parents, they respect you even if you aren't respected by society. Parents tend to do that. That's the lesson we need to learn, that parental love of acceptance of the individual. And that's the structure, that's the element which structures society and wealth, because that is a self-determined, those things are self-determined. Happiness and affluence are self-determined. How I am, how I feel is self-determined, because no one else knows how I feel. I have to determine it for myself. So getting back to all these right and left-wing divisions that take place in the world, they're all based on trying to engineer society. The left wants to engineer more domestically, but they also want to engineer foreign, whereas the right tends to just want to punish. It's more into punishment of the external. But either one is punishment. Trying to control society is a contradiction for the left, in the foreign country, because damned well that if you're gonna have to have people there with guns, and you're keeping, well, that's not so much a contradiction, but you're keeping the life from being voluntary. Otherwise, they wouldn't have guns, right? You're keeping the Israelis and the Arabs from working it out themselves, as Ron Paul pointed out. When you give both of them weaponry, whereas if they were impoverished in terms of weaponry, in terms of the ability to weaponize themselves, what would they do? They'd have to work it out themselves, you see. And this is the ideal, to let people be, to let them work things out themselves, whether they want to do it as states or as counties or cities, or as individuals, which what I would say would be the only way to go. So that's the imperative for life, is to have it be voluntary. And government has no special characteristics. Who are these people that we appoint? They're pretenders. They're con men. That's all they are. They're power grabbers and power holders. And this battle between Trump and the other side, I tend to favor Trump because the other side is the established thieves. It's a band of thieves. Trump's got problems, but he's not part of the band of thieves. So let's break it down. Let's break it down and break it down all the way to me. There should be 7 billion governments on the world. Everything else should be voluntary. And by the way, because there's 180 something governments in the world, that's anarchy. And it works fine. Except that governments like war because they don't have to do the fighting, or they don't have to pay for it. Okay, let's try that.